I was petrified for a long time in a state of silent terror, as if an invisible and obscure force was pushing me to stay with my back against the chest in which I had found the cursed dagger and on which I had previously fallen asleep. I hoped it was the frequent and not implausible cliché of the dream within a dream, and that I would soon wake up to tell my companions about the horrible and surreal visions that stress and alcohol must have induced in my sleep. But unfortunately, this did not happen. When, after a span of time I could not precisely quantify, I realized that my comrades were truly gone, I regained motion, albeit clumsily and overcome with nausea, and started to examine the room for any clue that might lead me to their tracks. Apparently, there was nothing suspicious, except for a few overturned rum bottles on the floor, probably dropped by my companions as they fell asleep. I examined a few and noticed they all produced the characteristic pungent smell of ether, reassuring me that the nightmare was likely just a consequence of poisoning and of the macabre suggestions I had experienced earlier. However, this left the mystery of my comrade's disappearance unsolved. For a moment, I found comfort in the idea that they had simply woken up before me and were waiting for me in the entrance hall, or that at worst, they had heard something that impelled them to leave without being able to wake me. So, grasping my trusty Colt, I decided to go back and search for them. I traversed the kitchen again, which, though still in a state of putrid abandonment, was now totally and incredibly devoid of the numerous colonies of invertebrates we had observed earlier, and that seemed to convey some cryptic message. Passing through the room with the immense mahogany table, I paused to observe, through the only window present, the small courtyard outside, used by the Comte de C as a cemetery for those not belonging to the lineage. In particular, I noticed that a tombstone with the engravings MM was half open, a detail to which I did not pay much attention at the moment, attributing it to the prolonged exposure to the weather and to the abandonment the tomb had been subjected to for at least a couple of decades, but the significance of which I would only understand a few hours later. When I returned to the entrance hall dominated by the majestic staircase, there was no trace of my companions. Therefore, I went outside and observed that our jeep was still there, under the relentless storm, making it impossible for them to have left. Then I went back inside, and despite I was experiencing dyspnea-induced nausea, I gathered all the breath I had left and started shouting their names repeatedly. However, the only response I received was the echo of my own voice. At this point, my instinct for self-preservation advised me to leave the cursed chateau forever, but I had to desist when I realized that Hendrix had the car keys, and it would be impossible for me to venture into the surrounding woods as long as the storm continued. Tormented by the terrible suggestion that something horrible could happen to me at any moment, and oppressed by a growing sense of nausea, I continued to explore the abandoned castle. For hours I wandered through the deserted corridors, decaying halls, and labyrinthine ups and downs of half-destroyed staircases, until I finally reached, exhausted, the base of one of the oldest and most dilapidated turrets of the castle, nearby a sort of medieval prison. Observing it closely under the feeble light of a match, I noticed some traces of blood on the floor and walls, a detail that made me fear the worst for my companions, but which was not necessarily connected to them. It was not unlikely that pagan rituals were performed there, as we had previously supposed while exploring the occult library, and as suggested by the presence of sinister carvings engraved into the limestone walls of the cell, depicting astral seals and demonic creatures dwelling in the marine depths. Oppressed by a growing sense of anguish, I meticulously checked that my Colt was loaded. Then I ventured down an adjacent corridor so dark I could barely discern its details. After a few steps, I noticed the dry, brief sound of my footsteps suddenly changed in tone, producing a creak. Kneeling down to illuminate the floor with the last match at my disposal, I saw that beneath my feet was a moisture-laden trapdoor with a ring. I was ready to open it, eager to explore its secrets, when I was unexpectedly assailed by a glacial current from behind, extinguishing the match and inducing me to turn swiftly, aiming my Colt into the darkness. I did not hesitate to pull the trigger, both to strike at a potential enemy and to utilize the gunpowder's combustion to cast light into the darkness. Yet I neither struck nor glimpsed anything. Regaining my composure, my interest returned to the trapdoor, which I now had to locate by touch in the absence of light. Once I found and grasped the handle again, I managed to lift the trapdoor effortlessly, a fact that did not please me as the total absence of friction implied someone else had used it recently. However, before I could become more anxious, I was inundated by a sudden exhalation of noxious fumes, likely due to a great proliferation of molds in the underground. These fumes, magnifying the already present nausea caused by ether, made me startle for a moment, inducing me to vomit copiously. Only the fear of facing another horrid nightmare like the previous one kept me from fainting. Now, on all fours before the open trapdoor, I noticed the top of a stone staircase. Aware of the risks, but determined to find my companions, I decided to descend. During the long descent, I could not help but feel anguished, thinking of it as a metaphorical descent into the infernal realm of Satan, terrified by the hypothetical horrors I might face. My mind, now unburdened from the chains of reason, persistently projected unpleasant images of the skeletal creature and the gigantic toad god. My body moved almost unconsciously, and after what felt like an interminable period, I reached the bottom, finding myself at the beginning of a narrow, seemingly endless stone-paved passage. Breathless due to the progressively scarcer oxygen in the underground, I entered it, moving with my back against one of the damp and rough walls that lined it. In total obscurity, I continued to torment myself with grotesque conjectures about the horrible fate that I was now certain awaited me at the end of the passage. Yet, driven by the desire to find my companions, the idea of turning back never once seemed reasonable. When I finally glimpsed the fissure marking the end of the narrow passage, I was surprised to see a soft, bluish luminescence emanating from it. Upon emerging from the opening, I realized it was the same type of light that illuminated the subterranean cavern of my nightmare, and in contrast to the reigning darkness, it poetically resembled the starry sky. However, this moment of blessed wonder abruptly ceased when I noticed, carved into the rock on the wall opposite the one I had emerged from, a solitary and fascinating massive oaken door. It was completely covered with the moisture of the place and with calcareous deposits that must have accumulated over decades. I had no doubt. If ever there was a clue that could lead me back to my companions, it had to be hidden behind that door. With my heart pounding so fiercely, it felt as though it might burst from my chest. I gripped my Colt in my right hand and prepared to seize the rusty handle with my left, when, behold! With a sinister creak, the door swung open spontaneously, revealing the malevolent figure of the skeletal creature that had, in my nightmare, sacrificed my companions to the monstrous toad god. The instinct to shoot, which had already arisen even before the unexpected apparition, was immediately suppressed by the creepy gleam of its hollow, abyssal eyes and the diabolic grin that followed. Before I could react, the creature began a terrifying monologue, dreadful both for its revelations as for the creature's hoarse, inhuman voice.
Ah, foolish human, the moment has finally arrived, the moment to learn the bitter truth. Was that not what you sought? To understand whether the nightmare you experienced was merely a product of your mind, or the diabolical manifestation of a higher intellect. Well, I must confess that when your blood-stained hieroglyphs of the sacred dagger you activated the seal that opened a portal to a reality unknown to most mortal men. Have you ever heard of the Garnon Kai in the realm of Kanayan, where the slumbering Satogwa resides? Indeed, it is there that your companions met their end, elevating the meaning of their existences in sacrifice to the great Lord God. It is there that I, the great alchemist Charles Le Sorcier, son of Michel Mauvais, have resided weekly in incorporeal form for the past half century, when Count Antoine thwarted my plans, ending my long wanderings in the world of the living. Only a fool could believe he could break my curse, for since the 13th century I have venerated and nourished the great Satogwa, the great god who granted me the infinite wisdom that allowed me to comprehend the secrets of alchemy and solve the mystery of eternal life. Even in life, I wandered perpetually between the world of light and that of eternal oblivion. Listen to these words, foolish creature. Even deprived of my corporeal form, I will always find a way to return to the realm of mortals. However, a mere spectre has limited powers, and it is for this reason that I must be grateful to you, my dear stranger.
At this point, the frightening creature showed a slight sign of fatigue, beginning to cough and spit thick, black blood. Then it continued.
When you die, your spirit weakens quickly, and you cannot act directly on material things, but you can induce those still living to perform acts on your behalf. And you, my unconscious servant, have perfectly fulfilled your task. But you see, the process is incomplete. And it is for this reason I have left you still in the world of the living. Although I have restored my old body, it is now too compromised to house my soul, and I do not have much time left. Therefore you, dear human, will have the honor of being my new vessel of flesh and bone. But do not fear, I will let you wander a little longer in this world, for the bonds of alchemy are indissoluble, and I cannot claim your soul until you turn 32. So be joyful and enjoy the time you have left. In exchange, I give you this chateau and all the riches within it, but do not interpret this as an act of generosity, for when I come to claim your soul, I will take it all back.
At this point, the infernal creature erupted into a thunderous and diabolical laughter, concluding its speech and breaking the paralysis its unsettling and magnetic presence had induced in me. Regaining my composure, I did not hesitate to empty the entire magazine of the Colt at it, causing a bizarre dissolution of its body into a pile of dust that dispersed into the air. What happened next, I remember vaguely, as in a state of frenzy and terror I desperately sought an escape route from the wicked underground. Beyond the massive oaken door previously barricaded by the skeletal creature, I crossed into what appeared to be the Alchemist's laboratory, full of mysterious potions, indecipherable scrolls, and precious metals apparently generated from some kind of furnace. However, any sense of curiosity was instantly suppressed by the urgency to escape. Finally, I noticed a crack in the wall opposite the door through which I had entered, revealing a flight of stairs. Without hesitation, I ascended them with lightning speed, emerging in the cemetery courtyard through the semi-open tombstone I had observed earlier through the window, a passage that for centuries must have served as Charles Le Sorcier's secret route. I collapsed exhausted on the overgrown grass of the courtyard, and only after some time I realized that the storm had finally ceased. I walked to the nearest village to inform the local authorities about the disappearance of my brothers in arms. However, when I saw the mocking expressions on their faces, It became clear they regarded my story as nothing more than the ramblings of a soldier whose reason was completely compromised by all the horrors he had witnessed during the war. Disheartened, I decided to desist and refresh myself at the Loire Ivre, where an extremely old, pale, bearded man wearing a skull cap and a weirdly familiar, voluminous black robe approached me to deliver a scroll declaring me the sole owner of the abandoned castle and all its contents. When I looked up to speak to him, he had vanished, and no one in the inn claimed to have seen him. For several months, I stayed in a room at the inn. The idea of sojourning in the accursed chateau never appealed to me, although for some time I visited it almost daily in the futile search of my companions. A few months ago, having given up hope of finding them, I even considered returning to Utah and starting a new life. However, I met Margot, the village florist, and decided she would be the right person with whom to share the unwanted inheritance and forget about the sinister experience. However, in a few hours I will turn 32, and in the past 2 weeks, the monstrous toad god and the diabolical alchemist have returned to haunt my dreams, claiming my sanity as a trophy. I don't know if it was all just a product of my imagination. Lately, I've even started to think that my companions never existed, since in the last days I realized that I'm suffering from some form of dementia or amnesia, often finding myself unconsciously returning from the chateau with my clothes stained by strange liquids. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see a pale, bearded old man instead of myself, and I question who I really am. Now, I must go, as I have written longer than intended. I will carry a load of dynamite into the castle's undergrounds and blow it all up, including myself if necessary. If you have read this far, it's likely that I have failed in my intent and that the castle is still there. Therefore, listen to me and leave this place immediately. But before you do, watch your back.